January 1968. As the massive Tet Offensive exploded across South Vietnam, one target stood apart. Hue, the ancient imperial capital, a city of emperors, culture, and history, suddenly fell under enemy control. Today, we explore the bloodiest and most prolonged battle of the offensive. A month-long house-to-house struggle fought within the historic walls of the Citadel, where American and ARVN troops faced a deeply entrenched enemy, and the war revealed its most brutal face. This is the fight for the soul of Vietnam. This is the Battle of Hue. Hue. The name itself evokes centuries of history, culture, and tradition. For over 140 years, from 1802 to 1945, it served as the imperial capital of Vietnam, the seat of the Nguyen dynasty, home to emperors, scholars, and poets. Its imperial citadel, surrounded by walls 20 feet thick and a moat, housed palaces, temples, and gardens that represented the soul of Vietnamese culture. By 1968, Hue remained Vietnam's intellectual and spiritual heart, a city of universities, pagodas, and ancient traditions. It was a place where history lived, where past and present coexisted peacefully along the banks of the Perfume River. It was also, by unspoken agreement, supposed to be off-limits. Both sides in the Vietnam War had largely avoided major combat in Hue, recognizing its cultural significance. The city had become a refuge, a place where the war seemed distant, where life continued with a semblance of normalcy. That illusion would shatter in the early morning hours of January 31, 1968. To understand what happened to Hue, we must first understand what the city was on the eve of the attack. Hue sat in central Vietnam, bisected by the Perfume River that flowed from the mountains to the sea. North of the river stood the Citadel, the massive fortress complex, nearly 2 square miles in area, surrounded by a 20-foot moat and walls that had withstood centuries. Within its walls lay the imperial enclosure, containing the Purple Forbidden City, the emperor's private residence, and dozens of palaces, temples, and administrative buildings. South of the river lay the new city, the modern commercial district, where government offices, shops, and residential neighborhoods sprawled along tree-lined streets. This was where most of the city's 140,000 residents lived and worked. The city's defenders were scattered and thin. A small detachment of U.S. advisors and support troops maintained a compound near the river. The main defense fell to ARVN forces, the South Vietnamese 1st Division, considered one of the best units in the ARVN, had its headquarters inside the Citadel. But as Tet Nguyen Dan, the Lunar New Year, approached in late January 1968, many ARVN soldiers were granted leave to celebrate with their families. The holiday was sacred, a time when even war traditionally paused. A ceasefire had been declared. The city relaxed. It was exactly what the communists were counting on. The attack on Hue was not spontaneous. It was meticulously planned, part of the larger Tet Offensive that would strike across South Vietnam simultaneously. But Hue was different. While other cities were targets for raids and quick strikes, Hue was to be occupied and held. The communist plan was audacious. Seize the entire city, establish a provisional revolutionary government, hold it long enough to demonstrate that the South Vietnamese government was powerless, and inspire the population to rise up and join the revolution. Hue would become the symbol of liberation, proof that the communists could take and govern cities, not just conduct guerrilla warfare in the jungle. To achieve this, they assembled a force of over 10,000 troops, elements of the 4th, 5th, and 6th PAVN regiments, along with local Viet Cong battalions. Throughout January, they infiltrated into positions around the city, hiding in villages, forests, and safe houses. Weapons were smuggled in. Attack routes were rehearsed. Lists were prepared, lists of names. Lists of people who would need to be eliminated. January 31st, 1968, 3:40 a.m. As fireworks celebrating the new year still echoed in the distance, the attack began. Thousands of ARVN and Viet Cong soldiers poured into Hue from multiple directions, from the west, northwest, and south. They moved with speed and coordination, overwhelming the scattered defenders. In the Citadel, the few ARVN troops on duty fought desperately but were quickly overwhelmed. Communist forces stormed through the gates, seized government buildings, and advanced on the 1st Division headquarters, a fortified compound in the northeast corner of the Citadel where ARVN General No Quang Truong and his staff held out behind thick walls. By dawn, the Viet Cong flag, gold star on a red and blue background, flew over the Citadel's flagpole, visible across the entire city. The symbolism was devastating. The ancient imperial capital, the cultural heart of Vietnam, was in communist hands. South of the river, in the new city, the situation was equally dire. Communist forces seized the provincial headquarters, the prison, releasing hundreds of inmates, and most of the residential neighborhoods. Only a few isolated pockets held out, including the MACV, Military Assistance Command Vietnam, compound, where a small group of U.S. advisors barricaded themselves and prepared for a siege. By midday on January 31st, the Communists controlled 80% of Hue. The attack had been a stunning success. And now, the occupation began. The Communist forces moved quickly to consolidate control. Propaganda teams spread through the neighborhoods, broadcasting revolutionary messages over loudspeakers, distributing leaflets, and calling on the population to support the National Liberation Front. Political cadres established a provisional government, setting up administrative offices in seized buildings. They organized rallies, raised flags, and attempted to create the appearance of a functioning alternative to the Saigon regime. For the residents of Hue, trapped in their homes as fighting raged around them, the situation was terrifying. Many stayed inside, huddled with their families, listening to gunfire and explosions, unsure who controlled which streets or what would happen next. And then the knock came. What happened next in Hue would become one of the darkest chapters of the Vietnam War, an atrocity that would only be fully understood weeks later, when the graves were discovered. The Communists had come with lists, detailed rosters of names compiled by Viet Cong intelligence networks operating in the city for years. These lists identified thousands of people, government officials, police officers, ARVN officers and soldiers, civil servants, Catholic priests, Buddhist monks, teachers, intellectuals, foreign doctors and aid workers, anyone associated with the Saigon government or considered a potential opponent of communist rule. Political cadres, accompanied by armed soldiers, went door to door, checking identities against the lists. Those whose names appeared were taken away, told they were being relocated for their safety, or that they needed to report for re-education, or simply arrested without explanation. They were marched to assembly points, schoolyards, pagodas, empty buildings. From there, they were taken in groups to remote locations, ravines, riverbeds, jungle clearings, sandy beaches along the coast. And there, they were executed. Some were shot. Others were beaten to death with rifle butts and shovels. Some were buried alive, hands bound with wire, forced into pits, and covered with earth. The Communists showed particular brutality toward Catholic priests and nuns, whom they viewed as instruments of Western imperialism. The killings continued throughout the Communist occupation, a systematic, calculated purge designed to eliminate any potential resistance and to terrorize the population into submission. Viet Cong cadres justified it as revolutionary justice, the elimination of enemies of the people and reactionary elements. It was mass murder. The exact death toll would never be fully known. When South Vietnamese forces finally retook the city and began searching, they found mass graves scattered throughout Hue and the surrounding countryside. The first discoveries came in early February, a grave containing 300 bodies near the Gia Hoi High School. Then another with 100 bodies. Then more. Over the following months, as recovery efforts continued, the numbers grew. Bodies were found in De Mai Creek, dozens of victims with hands bound, buried in the sand. More were discovered in shallow graves in the Phu Cam Canal area. Catholic priests from the Phu Cam Cathedral were found executed together. By the time the search ended, the estimated death toll from the Hue massacre ranged from 2,800 to over 6,000 civilians. Men, women, some children, systematically murdered by communist forces during the occupation. The discovery of the mass graves profoundly impacted both South Vietnamese and international perceptions of the war. For South Vietnamese, it validated their worst fears about what would happen if the communists won. For Americans, it complicated the moral calculus of the war, evidence that the enemy was capable of systematic atrocities. While the killings proceeded in the shadows, small pockets of resistance held out against overwhelming odds. Inside the Citadel, General Truong's 1st Division headquarters became a fortress. A few hundred ARVN troops, along with their families who had taken refuge there, held the northeast corner of the Citadel. They were completely surrounded, cut off, under constant attack, but they refused to surrender. Truong coordinated his defense via radio, calling in artillery fire from ARVN batteries outside the city and organizing counterattacks when the communists tried to breach the compound walls. His troops fought with desperate courage, knowing that surrender likely meant execution. South of the river, the MACV compound, a walled complex housing U.S. advisors, held out under siege. The defenders, numbering fewer than 200 Americans and South Vietnamese, fought off repeated attacks, using the compound's walls and buildings for cover. They called for reinforcements, for air support, for relief. But in the chaos of the first days, help was slow to arrive. Because American commanders, focused initially on Saigon and other priority targets, had underestimated the situation in Hue. They believed it was another raid, that communist forces would withdraw after a few days, as they had in other cities. They didn't understand that the communists intended to hold Hue, that they had committed over 10,000 troops, that this would not be a raid, but a siege. It would take the Americans another 24 hours to recognize the truth. And when they did, they would send the Marines. The battle for Hue was about to escalate into one of the longest, bloodiest urban battles in American military history. February 1st, 1968. The 1st Marine units arrived in Hue with minimal intelligence and unclear objectives. Company A, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, a rifle company of about 150 men, rode into the city aboard trucks, expecting to conduct a brief relief operation. They thought the fighting was nearly over. They were immediately ambushed. As the convoy entered the southern outskirts of the new city, communist forces opened fire from buildings, rooftops, and alleyways. RPG rounds slammed into vehicles. Machine gun fire tore through the trucks. Marines bailed out, scrambling for cover. Within minutes, the Marines realized they had driven into a full-scale battle. More Marine units poured in, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines and later 1st Battalion, 5th Marines. Their mission, fight their way through the new city, relieve the MACV compound, and secure the southern bank of the river. What followed was brutal, house-to-house urban combat unlike anything most American forces had experienced since World War II. The new city became a killing ground. The PAVN defenders had turned every building into a fortress, sandbagging windows, cutting firing ports through walls, placing machine guns to create interlocking fields of fire. They fought from upper floors, from basements, from behind courtyard walls. The Marines advanced block by block, building by building. They used grenades to clear rooms, M16 rifles and M60 machine guns to suppress enemy fire, and sheer determination to keep moving forward. The fighting was often at ranges measured in meters, sometimes hand-to-hand. Casualties mounted rapidly. Marines were hit by sniper fire from unseen positions. B-40 rockets fired from windows destroyed Marine squads. Medics worked frantically to stabilize wounded men for evacuation. Every street corner was a potential ambush. Every doorway could hide a machine gun nest. The weather added to the misery. Cold rain fell constantly, turning the streets to mud, soaking uniforms, reducing visibility. The Marines fought in a gray, wet hell, exhausted, running low on ammunition, seeing their friends die beside them. Initially, Marine commanders restricted the use of heavy weapons, fearing the destruction of U.S. historic buildings. Artillery fire was limited. Airstrikes were forbidden within the city. The Marines were expected to take the city with rifles and grenades, minimizing collateral damage. It was an impossible standard. The ARVN were not constrained by such concerns. They used the city's architecture against the Marines, fighting from positions that could only be destroyed with heavy firepower. By mid-February, the restrictions began to lift. M48 tanks were brought in, their 90mm guns blasting holes in fortified buildings. Tear gas was used to flush defenders from bunkers. Rocket fire from helicopter gunships pounded enemy positions. Artillery finally opened up, dropping shells on buildings confirmed to hold ARVN troops. Hue was being destroyed to save it. If the fighting in the new city was brutal, the battle for the Citadel was even worse. The Citadel's massive walls, 20 feet thick, made of earth and stone, were nearly impervious to conventional weapons. The interior was a maze of narrow streets, ancient buildings, gardens, and courtyards, perfect defensive terrain. And the ARVN had fortified every gate, every intersection, every palace. The task of retaking the Citadel fell primarily to South Vietnamese forces, ARVN troops of the 1st Division, reinforced by elite airborne and Marine battalions. They launched their attack from General Truong's headquarters compound, fighting outward block by block toward the Imperial enclosure at the heart of the Citadel. The ARVN troops fought with courage and determination. This was their city, their history they were fighting for. But the cost was staggering. Companies were reduced to platoon strength. Officers were killed leading assaults. Wounded men fought on because there were no replacements. The fighting around the Citadel's gates was particularly savage. Each gate was a fortress, thick wooden doors reinforced with iron, flanked by defensive positions. The ARVN defended them fanatically, knowing that losing a gate meant losing control of an entire sector. ARVN forces used satchel charges to blow open gates, flamethrowers to clear bunkers, and recoilless rifles to destroy fortifications. They advanced meter by meter, often losing dozens of men to take a single building. U.S. Marine units also fought inside the Citadel. 1st Battalion, 5th Marines entered through the eastern wall in mid-February, tasked with clearing the northeastern section and linking up with ARVN forces. The Marines found the same nightmare of urban combat: fortified positions, sniper fire from every direction, mines and booby traps, and an enemy who refused to retreat. As the battle dragged into its 3rd week, all pretense of preserving the city's architecture vanished. Naval gunfire from U.S. destroyers offshore pounded the Citadel walls. Airstrikes, A-4 Skyhawks and F-4 Phantoms, dropped bombs and napalm on the Imperial enclosure. Artillery fire became continuous. The ancient palaces, structures that had stood for 150 years, burned. Temples collapsed. Gardens became cratered wastelands. The purple Forbidden City, the Emperor's sacred residence, was reduced to rubble. By late February, the ARVN defense was crumbling. They had fought for 25 days against overwhelming firepower, suffering catastrophic casualties. Supplies were running low. Reinforcements could not reach them. The siege was breaking. On February 24, 1968, ARVN troops launched the final assault on the Imperial Palace, the last major ARVN stronghold. After hours of intense fighting, they stormed the palace grounds and reached the flagpole where the Viet Cong banner had flown for nearly a month. At 5 p.m., the communist flag was lowered. The yellow and red flag of South Vietnam was raised in its place. The battle for Hue was over. But the city lay in ruins, and the true cost was only beginning to be counted. The Battle of Hue lasted 26 days, from January 31st to February 25th, with final clearing operations continuing into early March. It was the longest, bloodiest single battle of the Tet Offensive, and its cost was staggering. American casualties: over 150 U.S. Marines and soldiers killed, nearly 900 wounded. Some Marine companies lost more than 50% of their strength. Entire platoons were wiped out. The 1st and 5th Marine battalions would need months to rebuild. South Vietnamese casualties: nearly 400 ARVN troops killed, over 1,800 wounded. The elite units, the airborne, the Marines, the 1st Division, had been decimated. These were some of the best soldiers in the South Vietnamese military, and their losses would be felt for years. Communist casualties: estimates varied, but between 5,000 and 8,000 ARVN and Viet Cong troops were killed in the battle. The forces that had seized the city had been virtually annihilated. The communists left behind hundreds of weapons, tons of ammunition, and their dead comrades buried in shallow graves or left in the ruins. But the most tragic toll was civilian. Over 5,000 residents of Hue died during the battle, some killed in the crossfire, some buried in collapsed buildings from artillery and airstrikes, some executed by both sides during the chaos. And between 2,800 and 6,000 were murdered in the Hue massacre, systematically executed by communist forces during the occupation, their bodies discovered in mass graves throughout the city and surrounding countryside. The physical destruction was equally devastating. Over 80% of the city lay in ruins. The new city was a landscape of collapsed buildings, cratered streets, and burned-out shells. The Citadel, the crown jewel of Vietnamese imperial history, was shattered, its palaces destroyed, its walls breached, its gardens obliterated. Tens of thousands of civilians were homeless. The infrastructure, water, electricity, sewage, was destroyed. It would take years to rebuild, and some structures, lost forever, could never be replaced. Militarily, the Battle of Hue was an American and South Vietnamese victory. The city was retaken. The communist forces were destroyed. The provisional government they established never functioned. The general uprising they hoped to inspire never materialized. But strategically, Hue, like the larger Tet Offensive, was a devastating blow to American credibility. The images that came out of Hue told a story the American public could not ignore. U.S. Marines fighting house to house in a decimated city. Ancient temples burning. Refugees fleeing with nothing. The battle lasting not days, but weeks. The narrative of progress, of winning hearts and minds, of building a stable South Vietnam, was impossible to sustain when juxtaposed with images of an entire city reduced to rubble. The credibility gap, the disconnect between what the Johnson administration claimed and what Americans could see on their televisions, became a chasm. If the enemy was weakening, how could they occupy a major city for a month? If the war was being won, why did it take 26 days of brutal urban combat to retake it? The Battle of Hue was many things, a testament to the courage of Marines and ARVN soldiers who fought through hell to retake their city, a tragedy for the civilians caught in the crossfire and murdered in the massacre, and a turning point in the Vietnam War's political trajectory. It demonstrated that no city was safe, that the enemy was far from defeated, and that the cost of victory, measured in lives, destruction, and time, was unsustainable. Hue, the city of emperors and poets, had become a symbol of the war's futility, and its ruins would haunt American policy for years to come. After 26 days of grinding combat, the city of Hue was finally recaptured. The military victory came at the expense of its cultural heart, with much of the citadel left in ruins. But the cost was measured not just in historic stone, but in human life. The discovery of mass graves, revealing the systematic execution of thousands of civilians by the communist forces during their occupation, shocked the world. This profound tragedy underscored the terrible stakes and the absolute brutality that lay beneath the Revolutionary War. The Battle of Hue, with its graphic depictions of urban destruction and atrocity, was a devastating psychological defeat for the U.S. and hastened the collapse of public faith in the war's objectives. If you want to understand the monumental struggles, the horrific nature of urban combat, and the irreversible tragedies of human conflict, make sure you subscribe to History of Conflicts. Hit that notification bell and leave a comment below. We want to know, given the city's historical importance, was the initial reluctance of U.S. commanders to use overwhelming firepower justified, or did it only prolong the brutal fighting inside the citadel? Thanks for watching.